And welcome to another Thursday Night Blather, this time from an undisclosed location somewhere in the Midwest. Well, story time once again. I'm doing this from the road, which is unusual, but this is the anniversary of something that happened 50 years ago today. So I'm gonna, fortunately, the 50 years ago today fell on a Thursday, so I'm gonna keep my usual 9 o'clock Eastern time and blather live at you. And I'm going to read this story. All these stories that I read, they're all written in the mid 2000s, like 2004, 5, 6, that period of time. And honestly, I'm reading them out loud for the first time. So read it with me. I'm going to put it up on the screen. This takes place in Dannemora, New York, April 2nd, 1976, 5:30 p.m. So 50 years and 3.5 hours ago. Here we go. Jimmy Miles was a scary looking and imposingly big guy. He had the words Hell's Angels tattooed on his bicep. His arm was about as wide as my leg. The first time I met Jimmy Miles was just before my first meal in the mess hall a few hours after my arrival in Building 40. I just finished spending the previous 3 weeks locked in a cell for 20 or more hours a day in the maximum security portion of the Clinton State Penitentiary in Dannemora, New York. It was my first taste of the New York State correctional system. I'd been in maximum security for orientation and classification so they could decide the appropriate place for me to spend the next 1 year to life. It was the second time I'd been through a sleepover orientation, and I knew one thing for sure. Prison orientation was certainly a lot less fun than college orientation. After 22 days of orientation, they decided to put me in Building 40. Building 40 was a quasi-separate facility inside the medium security prison called Clinton Annex, which was a reconverted mental hospital, which was by the way, that's kind of surreal because just before I pleaded guilty and surrendered earlier that year, I saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So here I was in a reconverted insane asylum, mental hospital, whatever you call it. Okay. It was supposedly considered to be an honor camp. The problem was that it housed 99 inmates, and there were only around 24 of us who really fit the profile, like nonviolent first offender, white-collar crime, etc. The rest were a cross-section of the general prison population, except that nobody with more than 2 years to go before their parole hearing was housed there. In theory, this meant that everyone in Building 40 had something to lose by getting in trouble. In theory. I certainly had a lot to lose by getting in trouble. 1 year to life. That meant I was eligible to be paroled after 1 year, but the state had the right to incarcerate me for the rest of my life if it saw fit. Thank you for your drug laws, Mr. Rockefeller. Time for me to figure out how to be a model prisoner like right now. Of course, not everybody seemed to necessarily have as much to lose as I did or care about losing it. Building 40 was supposed to be a big improvement in my reality compared to where I'd spent the last 22 days. I wasn't so sure about that. 55 inmates slept in bunks in one open area in the upper part of the building. 4 rooms containing 6 beds were downstairs, surrounding another open area with 18 beds. The capacity was supposed to be 97, but they stuck 2 more beds in the small corridor between the inner exit door and the outer exit door. I was in one of those last 2 beds. The other one had not been assigned. While the annex was classified as a whole as medium security, Building 40, also known as Camp Adirondack, fell into the minimum security classification. I didn't really see the difference, but they were right about one thing. I felt minimally secure. So when Jimmy Miles walked towards me outside the mess hall that first night, he was not a welcome sight, to say the least. I felt more than a twinge of panic set in as I realized he wasn't just walking in my general direction. He appeared to be walking right up to me. And as it turns out, he was doing just that. I was sure, to say the least, that this was not going to be good. If that stupid book I'd read earlier, and I'm going to get to that stupid book in a minute, if that stupid book I'd read earlier that day was a true indication of what goes on in prison, then I had some serious trouble on my hands. If the book was correct, then I was about to be tested, and I needed to punch this guy in the face as hard as I could to avoid being labeled as a punk. But if I got into a fight, I'd be put in solitary and my parole would be in jeopardy. Plus, this would not be a fight. This guy could kill me before I even finished making a fist. I just stood there frozen like a deer in the headlights. He looked me over. I felt like a side of beef being examined by the neighborhood butcher. As much as I wanted this moment to end, I dreaded whatever was going to follow it even more. Scotty, I thought, if you're up there, this would be a really good time to beam me the fuck up. Okay, now we're going to flash back to earlier that afternoon, down in Moore, New York, April 2nd, 1976, at 1 p.m. And here we go. Earlier that day, less than an hour after my initial arrival in Building 40, I had a visitor of sorts. He introduced himself as Shake and said he was the guy in charge of supplies. He was very friendly. He sort of reminded me of one of the resident assistants I knew from the dorms at Albany State. He brought me some fresh sheets with him and a pillow and a blanket. He asked if I had a pair of slippers, and when I said I didn't, he pulled a pair out of his supply bag and gave them to me. We chatted for quite a while. It was the first decent conversation I'd had in almost a month. Before he left, he handed me a paperback entitled The Beast Within. He suggested I read it as soon as I had time. What a laugh. I had nothing but time. He said, just be cool and you won't have nothing to worry about. I thanked him for the supplies and the book. Yeah, I'll make sure you read it, he added. We shook hands and he took off. I began to feel less uptight about this new place. It felt so good to have so quickly met someone I could trust. Meanwhile, it was still a few hours before dinner call, so I started reading the book. Why not? Well, it turns out this book was a shockingly vivid and violent prison novel about what happens to a heterosexual pacifist in his early 20s who was thrown into prison for the first time and discovers the horrific world of involuntary homosexuality. Under unimaginable pressure, he succumbs to the advances of a particularly aggressive inmate in exchange for perceived protection for the rest of the prison population, only to find himself methodically and violently stripped of every shred of humanity and dignity he possessed. Not exactly uplifting stuff for a 22-year-old heterosexual pacifist to read on his first day in an unfamiliar prison. No, it was not. My friend Augie had tried to warn me about this kind of thing when I was out on bail. He had implored me to start working out and get some bulk before I went inside, but I was too depressed about my situation to even consider it. As I read on, I found myself wishing that I'd listened to Augie. Still, the events depicted in the book didn't take place in an honor camp, so I was sure I was going to be okay. Well, hopefully. Yeah, keep hoping. Shit. I closed the inner door to the corridor. I never thought I would miss the iron bars on my cell. Being locked in would be a small price to pay for keeping the rest of the world locked out. Eventually, the sound of voices in the main room told me that the other inmates were back from their work cruise. I didn't open the door. With my eyes shut tight, I pressed my lips together and bit down on both of them from the inside. Like that. Hoping to suppress the freak out that I saw looming on the horizon. I felt like I was on the top of a 10-mile-high roller coaster that was pausing just before the first drop and waiting for me to take a good look down before it would roll on. I refused to open my eyes and look down. I focused on breathing, deep and slow. How many inhales and exhales before I was out of this place? Was it a predetermined number? If so, that meant I should breathe faster. But something in me didn't want to do that. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. The voices in the main room grew louder and louder. Finally, I decided to try seeing again. So I opened my eyes and I read some more of the book. It got scarier and scarier as I read further. And as I read further, I identified more and more with the hero/victim. I felt my own humanity slipping away as he was stripped of his own. The voices in the main room were now louder than ever. I was back at the top of the roller coaster, but now my eyes were open, irrevocably wide. The freak out on the horizon was coming at me full speed. I decided for my own sanity to skip to the last chapter, figuring that would be some sort of happy ending would get me through the rest of the day. Well, in the end, the main character, a guy locked up for selling marijuana, had tried fighting back. For his efforts, he was beaten to a pulp and gang raped. He finally landed in the prison hospital where he hanged himself. The end. I wanted to throw the book on the floor and stomp on it, but the fear of being heard kept me sitting cross-legged on my bed with my fingers clutching the still open book. There were 2 doors in the corridor where I sat terrified of what might be coming in the coming days, or was it years? The door in front of me led me to the rest of Building 40 and everybody in it. The door behind me led to the freezing cold outdoors. I'd heard that local farmers were paid $50 in a bag of feed to return escaped convicts, dead or alive. I took a long look at the door behind me. It actually had a sign above it that said exit. Somebody had quite a sense of humor. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't make it happen. Jerry Garcia's singing of Robert Hunter's words echoed. You can't go back and you can't stand still. If the thunder don't get you, the lightning will. Yeah, anyway. I thought about grabbing the notebook and doing some more work on the chapter I'd started writing. Writing had gotten me through those 22 days of maximum security, where I'd filled 2 notebooks with my words. Writing had made the fact that I was locked up actually make sense. I tried to remind myself that the real reason I was locked up had nothing to do with having sold 100 hits of LSD to a New York State undercover cop. That was what the state of New York said. My friend Wacky said I was locked up because I gambled using my freedom for a chip and lost. But that's not what I said. I said the real reason I was locked up was because it was the only way I would finally sit down and unleash via the written word the damn burst of thoughts that needed to explode from me. It was the only way I would finally get my words on paper. I considered myself to be privileged to have the unique opportunity to see prison from the inside and absorb all the perspectives I never would have otherwise experienced. As long as I kept writing, this rationalization kept me from internalizing the unthinkable fact that I was a prisoner. I decided that the terror I was feeling was merely part of the experience I was writing about and therefore wasn't real. I just needed to be cool. Just be cool. You won't have nothing to worry about. Words of wisdom from good old Shake. I was far from calm, but I was starting to feel the freak out was finally fading. Finally, one of the guards yelled, "On the chow!" That's exactly what they said. It was on the this, on the that, on the movie, on the lights, on the chow. This time it was on the chow. It was time to finally venture through the inner door. Time to head to the mess hall and find out what dinner would smell like. After a long pause, I opened the inner door and followed the mass of the same green uniforms that I was wearing towards what I assumed was my next meal. I didn't want to talk to anybody, and nobody talked to me, except for this one guy who was mopping the hallway. He looked at me with no expression and said, "Hey, Mississippi," in a dull monotone. I nodded and kept on walking. Needless to say, I did not know that I was about to meet Jimmy Miles. I'm going to pause for a second. I want to talk about that book for just a moment, so let me exit out there. And there I am, and now I'm going to share my screen with my friend Grok, because I've been trying to find that book for years, The Beast Within. I've looked everywhere, I couldn't find it anywhere. And I finally, now with the aid of AI, specifically Grok, basically, I remembered a couple of characters from the book, specifically one named Queenie and another named Smitty. So with that information, I went to Grok, and Grok told me about a book called Fortune and Men's Eyes. And it says here, Fortune and Men's Eyes is a 1967 play by Canadian playwright John Herbert, based on his own experiences within the justice system. It depicts the brutal realities of prison life, power dynamics, violence, sexual coercion, rape, and the struggle to maintain masculinity in a Canadian reformatory. Naive young inmate Smitty, there's Smitty, is gradually hardened by the environment with openly gay characters like Queenie and Mona, highlighting themes of homosexuality and degradation and confinement, etc. Is adapted into a 1971 film and became a groundbreaking and controversial work in prison drama and early LGBTQ plus theater. And then about The Beast Within, it says I couldn't find any verified work titled The Beast Within. That's a direct adaptation. But basically, it says it could have been an unofficial bootleg, a locally produced or inmate written, drawn. So the fact that it came from the prison library probably meant it was just one of those things that who knows who wrote, somehow got it published and got it in the prison library. In any case, I read a book called The Beast Within. Apparently, the work is really from Fortune and Men's Eyes, and I really haven't worked up the courage to read Fortune and Men's Eyes. I'm not sure that I ever will. Reading The Beast Within was traumatic enough. So let's get back to the story, because we're about to reintroduce Jimmy Miles. Dannemora, New York, April 2nd, 1976, 5:30 p.m. Continued. Jimmy Miles looked me over for what felt like an eternity. I had time to play out 1,000 scenarios in my head. An eternity, after all, is a very long time. I was sure of one thing. Whatever happened next and how I dealt with it was going to be instrumental in how I would do my time in this place. He seemed to want to say something, but he kept stopping himself from saying it and kept looking me over with increasingly narrowing eyes. You know, he had that badass look on his face, walking, kind of flexing while he walked. You see that Hell's Angel tattoo, comes up to with that badass look. Now he narrows his eyes, he's looking me up and down. I eliminated walking away as a good choice and just stood there. He finally spoke. Hey, do they call you Ungie? I had no idea what to reply to that. Why would he know that? Not important. I decided to try the truth. Yeah, that's what my friends called me outside. Outside. Yeah, I figured this was as good a time as any to try using prison lingo. Jimmy's face started changing right before my eyes. He said nothing. He seemed to be very deep in some sort of thought. This was a defining moment. His face kept changing. My eyes left him for a moment to see how far away the nearest guard was. There wasn't a guard in sight, but I saw Shake walking towards the mess hall with a few other guys. They were trash talking each other about basketball. Could he stop this? Would he want to? I looked back at Jimmy. Now he was smiling. Not a lecherous or carnivorous grin. It was a warm and friendly smile. And then his eyes actually got a bit puppyish, and he said, So you're Ungie. I heard they were putting you here. Man, I tried some of that blotter acid you were selling in Albany. I got to tell you, man, that stuff was great. It changed my life. I was blown away. Needless to say, I was very glad he liked the blotters for any number of reasons. That was all that counted at the moment. But it was horrifying that my name had been used so indiscreetly in Albany. Once again, it was Robert Hunter's words that flowed through my mind. I guess it doesn't matter anyway. Come on, Ed, let me buy you dinner. I finally had something to laugh about. I followed him into the mess hall. And that's the end of that part of the story. That story continues, but it doesn't continue for a few more days. I will be back next Thursday with the next chapter. This is chapter 6 of the Prison Saga. Chapters 1 through 5 are in the description of this video. I thank you all very much for watching. The Boomer has blathered.